Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Lisa, Katie, Susan, Peter, and Joanna. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And this month, the month of February, you and everyone else who supports us on Patreon or through a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com will be entered into a special drawing at the end of the month, the prize for which is an exclusive episode made just for you. If you're interested in being entered into that drawing and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find links to Patreon and buymeacoffee.com in the show description. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue with what has become a bit of an annual tradition here at Boring Books for Bedtime, right around February 12th, and relax with more from On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, by Charles Darwin, M.A., Fellow of the Royal, Geological, Linnean, etc. Societies, author of Journal of Researches during HMS Beagle's Voyage Round the World, from the first edition, published in 1859 by John Murray, Albemarle Street, London. Let's pick up right where we left off in Chapter 4, Natural Selection. Let's begin. On the intercrossing of individuals. I must here introduce a short digression. In the case of animals and plants with separate sexes, it is of course obvious that two individuals must always unite for each birth. But in the case of hermaphrodites, this is far from obvious. Nevertheless, I am strongly inclined to believe that with all hermaphrodites, two individuals, either occasionally or habitually, concur for the reproduction of their kind. This view, I may add, was first suggested by Andrew Knight. We shall presently see its importance, but I must here treat the subject with extreme brevity, though I have the materials prepared for an ample discussion. All vertebrate animals, all insects, and some other large groups of animals pair for each birth. Modern research has much diminished the number of supposed hermaphrodites, and of real hermaphrodites a large number pair. That is, two individuals regularly unite for reproduction, which is all that concerns us. But still, there are many hermaphrodite animals which certainly do not habitually pair, and a vast majority of plants are hermaphrodites. What reason, it may be asked, is there for supposing in these cases that two individuals ever concur in reproduction. As it is impossible here to enter on details, I must trust to some general considerations alone. In the first place, I have collected so large a body of facts showing, in accordance with the almost universal belief of breeders, that with animals and plants, a cross between different varieties, or between individuals of the same variety but of another strain, gives vigor and fertility to the offspring, and on the other hand, that close interbreeding diminishes vigor and fertility, that these facts alone incline me to believe that it is a general law of nature, utterly ignorant though we be of the meaning of the law, that no organic being self-fertilizes itself for an eternity of generations, but that a cross with another individual is occasionally, perhaps at very long intervals, indispensable. On the belief that this is a law of nature, we can, I think, understand several large classes of facts, such as the following, which on any other view are inexplicable. Every hybridizer knows how unfavorable exposure to wet is to the fertilization of a flower, yet what a multitude of flowers have their anthers and stigmas fully exposed to the weather. But if an occasional cross be indispensable, the fullest freedom for the entrance of pollen from another individual will explain this state of exposure, more especially as the plant's own anthers and pistil generally stand so close together that self-fertilization seems almost inevitable. Many flowers, on the other hand, have their organs of fructification closely enclosed, as in the great Papilionaceous or pea family. But in several, perhaps in all such flowers, there is a very curious adaptation between the structure of the flower and the manner in which bees suck the nectar. For in doing this, they either push the flower's own pollen on the stigma or bring pollen from another flower. So necessary are the visits of bees to papilionaceous flowers that I have found, by experiments published elsewhere, that their fertility is greatly diminished if these visits be prevented. Now, it is scarcely possible that bees should fly from flower to flower, and not carry pollen from one to the other to the great good, as I believe, of the plant. Bees will act like a camel hair pencil, and it is quite sufficient just to touch the anthers of one flower, and then the stigma of another with the same brush to ensure fertilization. But it must not be supposed that bees would thus produce a multitude of hybrids between distinct species, for if you bring on the same brush a plant's own pollen and pollen from another species, the former will have such a prepotent effect that it will invariably and completely destroy, as has been shown by Gartner, any influence from the foreign pollen. When the stamens of a flower suddenly spring towards the pistil, or slowly move one after the other towards it, the contrivance seems adapted solely to ensure self-fertilization, and no doubt it is useful for this end. But the agency of insects is often required to cause the stamens to spring forward, as Colerouter has shown to be the case with the barberry, and curiously in this very genus, which seems to have a special contrivance for self-fertilization, it is well known that if very closely allied forms or varieties are planted near each other, it is hardly possible to raise pure seedlings, so largely do they naturally cross. In many other cases, far from there being any aids for self-fertilization, there are special contrivances, as I could show from the writings of C. Sprengel and from my own observations, which effectually prevent the stigma receiving pollen from its own flower. For instance, in Lobelia fulgens, there is a really beautiful and elaborate contrivance by which every one of the infinitely numerous pollen granules are swept out of the conjoined anthers of each flower before the stigma of that individual flower is ready to receive them. And as this flower is never visited, at least in my garden, by insects, it never sets a seed, though by placing pollen from one flower on the stigma of another, I raised plenty of seedlings, and whilst another species of lobelia growing close by, which is visited by bees, seeds freely. In very many other cases, though there be no special mechanical contrivance to prevent the stigma of a flower receiving its own pollen, yet as C. Sprengel has shown, and as I can confirm, either the anthers burst before the stigma is ready for fertilization, or the stigma is ready before the pollen of that flower is ready, so that these plants have in fact separated sexes and must habitually be crossed. How strange are these facts! How strange that the pollen and stigmatic surface of the same flower, though placed so close together, as if for the very purpose of self-fertilization, should in so many cases be mutually useless to each other. How simply are these facts explained on the view of an occasional cross with a distinct individual being advantageous or indispensable. If several varieties of the cabbage, radish, onion, and of some other plants be allowed to seed near each other, a large majority, as I have found, of the seedlings thus raised will turn out mongrels. For instance, I raised 233 seedling cabbages from some plants of different varieties growing near each other, and of these only 78 were true to their kind, and some even of these were not perfectly true. Yet the pistil of each cabbage flower is surrounded not only by its own 6 stamens, but by those of the many other flowers on the same plant. How then comes it that such a vast number of the seedlings are mongrelized? I suspect that it must arise from the pollen of a distinct variety, having a prepotent effect over a flower's own pollen, and that this is part of the general law of good being derived from the intercrossing of distinct individuals of the same species. When distinct species are crossed, the case is directly the reverse, for a plant's own pollen is always prepotent over foreign pollen. But to this subject we shall return in a future chapter. In the case of a gigantic tree covered with innumerable flowers, it may be objected that pollen could seldom be carried from tree to tree, and at most only from flower to flower on the same tree, and that flowers on the same tree can be considered as distinct individuals only in a limited sense. I believe this objection to be valid, but that nature has largely provided against it by giving to trees a strong tendency to bear flowers with separated sexes. When the sexes are separated, although the male and female flowers may be produced on the same tree, we can see that pollen must be regularly carried from flower to flower, and this will give a better chance of pollen being occasionally carried from tree to tree. That trees belonging to all orders have their sexes more often separated than other plants, I find to be the case in this country, and at my request, Dr. Hooker tabulated the trees of New Zealand, and Dr. Asa Gray those of the United States, and the result was as I anticipated. On the other hand, Dr. Hooker has recently informed me that he finds that the rule does not hold in Australia, and I have made these few remarks on the sexes of trees simply to call attention to the subject. Turning for a very brief space to animals, on the land there are some hermaphrodites, as land mollusca and earthworms, but these all pair. As yet, I have not found a single case of a terrestrial animal which fertilizes itself. We can understand this remarkable fact, which offers so strong a contrast with terrestrial plants, on the view of an occasional cross being indispensable, by considering the medium in which terrestrial animals live and the nature of the fertilizing element. For we know of no means, analogous to the action of insects and of the wind in the case of plants, by which an occasional cross could be effected with terrestrial animals without the concurrence of two individuals. Of aquatic animals, there are many self-fertilizing hermaphrodites, but here, currents in the water offer an obvious means for an occasional cross, and as in the case of flowers, I have as yet failed, after consultation with one of the highest authorities, namely Professor Huxley, to discover a single case of a hermaphrodite animal with the organs of reproduction so perfectly enclosed within the body that access from without and the occasional influence of a distinct individual can be shown to be physically impossible. Cirripedes long appeared to me to present a case of very great difficulty under this point of view, but I have been enabled, by a fortunate chance, elsewhere to prove that two individuals, though both are self-fertilizing hermaphrodites, do sometimes cross. It must have struck most naturalists as a strange anomaly that in the case of both animals and plants, species of the same family and even of the same genus, though agreeing closely with each other in almost their whole organization, yet are not rarely, some of them hermaphrodites and some of them unisexual. But if, in fact, all hermaphrodites do occasionally intercross with other individuals, the difference between hermaphrodites and unisexual species, as far as function is concerned, becomes very small. From these several considerations, and from the many special facts which I have collected, but which I am not here able to give, I am strongly inclined to suspect that both in the vegetable and animal kingdoms, an occasional intercross with a distinct individual is a law of nature. I am well aware that there are on this view many cases of difficulty, some of which I am trying to investigate. Finally, then, we may conclude that in many organic beings, a cross between two individuals is an obvious necessity for each birth. In many others it occurs perhaps only at long intervals, but in none, as I suspect, can self-fertilization go on for perpetuity. Circumstances favorable to natural selection. This is an extremely intricate subject. A large amount of inheritable and diversified variability is favorable, but I believe mere individual differences suffice for the work. A large number of individuals, by giving a better chance for the appearance within any given period of profitable variations, will compensate for a lesser amount of variability in each individual, and is, I believe, an extremely important element of success. Though nature grants vast periods of time for the work of natural selection, she does not grant an indefinite period, for as all organic beings are striving, it may be said, to seize on each place in the economy of nature, if any one species does not become modified and improved in a corresponding degree with its competitors, it will soon be exterminated. In man's methodical selection, a breeder selects for some definite object, and free intercrossing will wholly stop his work. But when many men, without intending to alter the breed, have a nearly common standard of perfection, and all try to get and breed from the best animals, much improvement and modification surely but slowly follow from this unconscious process of selection, notwithstanding a large amount of crossing with inferior animals. Thus it will be in nature, for within a confined area, with some place in its polity not so perfectly occupied as might be, natural selection will always tend to preserve all the individuals varying in the right direction, though in different degrees, so as better to fill up the unoccupied place. But if the area be large, its several districts will almost certainly present different conditions of life. And then, if natural selection be modifying and improving a species in the several districts, there will be intercrossing with the other individuals of the same species on the confines of each. And in this case, the effects of intercrossing can hardly be counterbalanced by natural selection, always tending to modify all the individuals in each district in exactly the same manner to the conditions of each. For in a continuous area, the conditions will generally graduate away insensibly from one district to another. The intercrossing will most affect those animals which unite for each birth, which wander much, and which do not breed at a very quick rate. Hence in animals of this nature, for instance in birds, varieties will generally be confined to separated countries, and this I believe to be the case. In hermaphrodite organisms which cross only occasionally, and likewise in animals which unite for each birth, but which wander little and which can increase at a very rapid rate, a new and improved variety might be quickly formed on any one spot, and might there maintain itself in a body, so that whatever intercrossing took place would be chiefly between the individuals of the same new variety. A local variety, when once thus formed, might subsequently slowly spread to other districts. On the above principle, nurserymen always prefer getting seed from a large body of plants of the same variety, as the chance of intercrossing with other varieties is thus lessened. Even in the case of slow-breeding animals, which unite for each birth, we must not overrate the effects of intercrosses in retarding natural selection. For I can bring a considerable catalogue of facts showing that within the same area, varieties of the same animal can long remain distinct, from haunting different stations, from breeding at slightly different seasons, or from varieties of the same kind preferring to pair together. Intercrossing plays a very important part in nature in keeping the individuals of the same species or of the same variety true and uniform in character. It will obviously thus act far more efficiently with those animals which unite for each birth. But I have already attempted to show that we have reason to believe that occasional intercrosses take place with all animals and with all plants. Even if these take place only at long intervals, I am convinced that the young thus produced will gain so much in vigor and fertility over the offspring from long-continued self-fertilization that they will have a better chance of surviving and propagating their kind, and thus, in the long run, the influence of intercrosses, even at rare intervals, will be great. If there exist organic beings which never intercross, uniformity of character can be retained amongst them, as long as their conditions of life remain the same, only through the principle of inheritance and through natural selection destroying any which depart from the proper type. But if their conditions of life change and they undergo modification, uniformity of character can be given to their modified offspring, solely by natural selection preserving the same favorable variations. Isolation also is an important element in the process of natural selection. In a confined or isolated area, if not very large, the organic and inorganic conditions of life will generally be in a great degree uniform, so that natural selection will tend to modify all the individuals of a varying species throughout the area in the same manner in relation to the same conditions. Intercrosses also with the individuals of the same species, which otherwise would have inhabited the surrounding and differently circumstanced districts, will be prevented. But isolation probably acts more efficiently in checking the immigration of better adapted organisms after any physical change, such as of climate or elevation of the land, etc. And thus new places in the natural economy of the country are left open for the old inhabitants to struggle for and become adapted to through modifications in their structure and constitution. Lastly, isolation, by checking immigration and consequently competition, will give time for any new variety to be slowly improved. And this may sometimes be of importance in the production of new species. If, however, an isolated area be very small, either from being surrounded by barriers or from having very peculiar physical conditions, the total number of the individuals supported on it will necessarily be very small, and fewness of individuals will greatly retard the production of new species through natural selection, by decreasing the chance of the appearance of favorable variations. If we turn to nature to test the truth of these remarks, and look at any small isolated area, such as an oceanic island, although the total number of the species inhabiting it will be found to be small, as we shall see in our chapter on geographical distribution, yet of these species a very large proportion are endemic, that is, have been produced there and nowhere else. Hence an oceanic island at first sight seems to have been highly favorable for the production of new species, but we may thus greatly deceive ourselves, for to ascertain whether a small isolated area or a large open area like a continent has been most favorable for the production of new organic forms, we ought to make the comparison within equal times, and this we are incapable of doing. Although I do not doubt that isolation is of considerable importance in the production of new species, on the whole I am inclined to believe that largeness of area is of more importance, more especially in the production of species which will prove capable of enduring for a long period and of spreading widely. Throughout a great and open area, not only will there be a better chance of favorable variations arising from the large number of individuals of the same species there supported, but the conditions of life are infinitely complex from the large number of already existing species. And if some of these many species become modified and improved, others will have to be improved in a corresponding degree, or they will be exterminated. Each new form also, as soon as it has been much improved, will be able to spread over the open and continuous area, and will thus come into competition with many others. Hence more new places will be formed, and the competition to fill them will be more severe on a large than on a small and isolated area. Moreover, great areas, though now continuous, owing to oscillations of level, will often have recently existed in a broken condition, so that the good effects of isolation will generally, to a certain extent, have concurred. Finally, I conclude that, although small isolated areas probably have been in some respects highly favorable for the production of new species, yet that the course of modification will generally have been more rapid on large areas, and what is more important, that the new forms produced on large areas, which already have been victorious over many competitors, will be those that will spread most widely, will give rise to most new varieties and species, and will thus play an important part in the changing history of the organic world. We can perhaps on these views understand some facts which will be again alluded to in our chapter on geographical distribution. For instance, that the productions of the smaller continent of Australia have formerly yielded, and apparently are now yielding, before those of the larger Europeo-Asiatic area. Thus also, it is that continental productions have everywhere become so largely naturalized on islands. On a small island, the race for life will have been less severe, and there will have been less modification and less extermination. Hence perhaps it comes that the flora of Madeira, according to Oswald here, resembles the extinct tertiary flora of Europe. All freshwater basins taken together make a small area compared with that of the sea or of the land, and consequently the competition between freshwater productions will have been less severe than elsewhere. New forms will have been more slowly formed, and old forms more slowly exterminated. And it is in fresh water that we find 7 genera of ganoid fishes, remnants of a once preponderant order. And in fresh water we find some of the most anomalous forms now known in the world, as the Ornithorhynchus and Lepidosiren, which like fossils connect to a certain extent orders now widely separated in the natural scale. These anomalous forms may almost be called living fossils. They have endured to the present day, from having inhabited a confined area, and from having thus been exposed to less severe competition. To sum up the circumstances favorable and unfavorable to natural selection, as far as the extreme intricacy of the subject permits, I conclude, looking to the future, that for terrestrial productions a large continental area, which will probably undergo many oscillations of level, and which consequently will exist for long periods in a broken condition, will be the most favorable for the production of many new forms of life likely to endure long and to spread widely. For the area will first have existed as a continent, and the inhabitants, at this period numerous in individuals and kinds, will have been subjected to very severe competition. When converted by subsidence into large separate islands, there will still exist many individuals of the same species on each island. Intercrossing on the confines of the range of each species will thus be checked. After physical changes of any kind, immigration will be prevented, so that new places in the polity of each island will have to be filled up by modifications of the old inhabitants, and time will be allowed for the varieties in each to become well modified and perfected. When, by renewed elevation, the island shall be reconverted into a continental area, there will again be severe competition. The most favored or improved varieties will be enabled to spread. There will be much extinction of the less improved forms, and the relative proportional numbers of the various inhabitants of the renewed continent will again be changed. And again, there will be a fair field for natural selection to improve still further the inhabitants and thus produce new species. That natural selection will always act with extreme slowness, I fully admit. Its action depends on there being places in the polity of nature which can be better occupied by some of the inhabitants of the country undergoing modification of some kind. The existence of such places will often depend on physical changes, which are generally very slow, and on the immigration of better adapted forms having been checked. But the action of natural selection will probably still oftener depend on some of the inhabitants becoming slowly modified, the mutual relations of many of the other inhabitants being thus disturbed. Nothing can be effected unless favorable variations occur, and variation itself is apparently always a very slow process. The process will often be greatly retarded by free intercrossing. Many will exclaim that these several causes are amply sufficient wholly to stop the action of natural selection. I do not believe so. On the other hand, I do believe that natural selection will always act very slowly, often only at long intervals of time, and generally on only a very few of the inhabitants of the same region at the same time. I further believe that this very slow, intermittent action of natural selection accords perfectly well with what geology tells us of the rate and manner at which the inhabitants of this world have changed. Slow though the process of selection may be, if feeble man can do much by his powers of artificial selection, I can see no limit to the amount of change, to the beauty and infinite complexity of the co-adaptations between all organic beings, one with another, and with their physical conditions of life, which may be effected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection. Extinction. This subject will be more fully discussed in our chapter on geology, but it must be here alluded to, from being intimately connected with natural selection. Natural selection acts solely through the preservation of variations in some way advantageous, which consequently endure. But as from the high geometrical powers of increase of all organic beings, each area is already fully stocked with inhabitants, it follows that as each selected and favored form increases in number, so will the less favored forms decrease and become rare. Rarity, as geology tells us, is the precursor to extinction. We can also see that any form represented by few individuals will, during fluctuations in the seasons or in the number of its enemies, run a good chance of utter extinction. But we may go further than this, for as new forms are continually and slowly being produced, unless we believe that the number of specific forms goes on perpetually and almost indefinitely increasing, numbers inevitably must become extinct. That the number of specific forms has not indefinitely increased, geology shows us plainly. And indeed, we can see reason why they should not have thus increased. For the number of places in the polity of nature is not indefinitely great. Not that we have any means of knowing that any one region has as yet got its maximum of species. Probably no region is as yet fully stocked. For at the Cape of Good Hope, where more species of plants are crowded together than in any other quarter of the world, some foreign plants have become naturalized, without causing, as far as we know, the extinction of any natives. Furthermore, the species which are most numerous in individuals will have the best chance of producing within any given period favorable variations. We have evidence of this in the facts given in the second chapter, showing that it is the common species which afford the greatest number of recorded varieties or incipient species. Hence, rare species will be less quickly modified or improved within any given period, and they will consequently be beaten in the race for life by the modified descendants of the commoner species. From these several considerations, I think it inevitably follows that as new species in the course of time are formed through natural selection, others will become rarer and finally extinct. The forms which stand in closest competition with those undergoing modification and improvement will naturally suffer most, and we have seen in the chapter on the struggle for existence that it is the most closely allied forms, varieties of the same species, and species of the same genus or of related genera, which, from having nearly the same structure, constitution, and habits, generally come into the severest competition with each other. Consequently, each new variety or species, during the progress of its formation, will generally press hardest on its nearest kindred and tend to exterminate them. We see the same process of extermination amongst our domesticated productions through the selection of improved forms by man. Many curious instances could be given, showing how quickly new breeds of cattle, sheep, and other animals, and varieties of flowers, take the place of older and inferior kinds. In Yorkshire, it is historically known that the ancient black cattle were displaced by the longhorns, and that these were swept away by the shorthorns. I quote the words of an agricultural writer, as if by some murderous pestilence. Divergence of character. The principle which I have designated by this term is of high importance on my theory and explains, as I believe, several important facts. In the first place, varieties, even strongly marked ones, though having somewhat of the character of species, as is shown by the hopeless doubts in many cases how to rank them, yet certainly differ from each other far less than do good and distinct species. Nevertheless, according to my view, varieties are species in the process of formation, or are, as I have called them, incipient species. How then does the lesser difference between varieties become augmented into the greater difference between species? That this does habitually happen, we must infer from most of the innumerable species throughout nature presenting well-marked differences. Mere chance, as we may call it, might cause one variety to differ in some character from its parents, and the offspring of this variety again to differ from its parent in the very same character and in a greater degree. But this alone would never account for so habitual and large an amount of difference as that between varieties of the same species and species of the same genus. As has always been my practice, let us seek light on this head from our domestic productions. We shall here find something analogous. A fancier is struck by a pigeon having a slightly shorter beak. Another fancier is struck by a pigeon having a rather longer beak. And on the acknowledged principle that fanciers do not and will not admire a medium standard, but like extremes, they both go on, as has actually occurred with tumbler pigeons, choosing and breeding from birds with longer and longer beaks, or with shorter and shorter beaks. Again, we may suppose that at an early period one man preferred swifter horses, another stronger and more bulky horses. The early differences would be very slight. In the course of time, from the continued selection of swifter horses by some breeders, and of stronger ones by others, the differences would become greater, and would be noted as forming two sub-breeds. Finally, after the lapse of centuries, the sub-breeds would become converted into two well-established and distinct breeds. As the differences slowly become greater, the inferior animals with intermediate characters, being neither very swift nor very strong, will have been neglected and will have tended to disappear. Here then we see in man's productions the action of what may be called the principle of divergence, causing differences, at first barely appreciable, steadily to increase, and the breeds to diverge in character, both from each other and from their common parent. But how, it may be asked, can any analogous principle apply in nature? I believe it can, and does apply most efficiently, from the simple circumstance that the more diversified the descendants from any one species become, in structure, constitution, and habits, by so much will they be better enabled to seize on many and widely diversified places in the polity of nature, and so be enabled to increase in numbers. We can clearly see this in the case of animals with simple habits. Take the case of a carnivorous quadruped, of which the number that can be supported in any country has long ago arrived at its full average. If its natural powers of increase be allowed to act, it can succeed in increasing, the country not undergoing any change in its conditions, only by its varying descendants seizing on places at present occupied by other animals. Some of them, for instance, being enabled to feed on new kinds of prey, either dead or alive, some inhabiting new stations, climbing trees, frequenting water, and some perhaps becoming less carnivorous. The more diversified in habits and structure the descendants of our carnivorous animal became, the more places they would be enabled to occupy. What applies to one animal will apply throughout all time to all animals. That is, if they vary, for otherwise natural selection can do nothing. So it will be with plants. It has been experimentally proved that if a plot of ground be sown with one species of grass, and a similar plot be sown with several distinct genera of grasses, a greater number of plants and a greater weight of dry herbage can thus be raised. The same has been found to hold good when first one variety and then several mixed varieties of wheat have been sown on equal spaces of ground. Hence, if any one species of grass were to go on varying, and those varieties were continually selected, which differed from each other in at all the same manner as distinct species and genera of grasses differ from each other, a greater number of individual plants of this species of grass, including its modified descendants, would succeed in living on the same piece of ground. And we well know that each species and each variety of grass is annually sowing almost countless seeds, and thus, as it may be said, is striving its utmost to increase its numbers. Consequently, I cannot doubt that in the course of many thousands of generations, the most distinct varieties of any one species of grass would always have the best chance of succeeding and of increasing its numbers, and thus of supplanting the less distinct varieties. And varieties, when rendered very distinct from each other, take the rank of species. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. I know this is called Boring Books for Bedtime, but I'm finding Darwin's ability to lay out his rationale and evidence most entertaining, and I hope you enjoyed that as well. If you'd like to read this fundamental text of science for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.